Welcome, everyone. For those of you that I don't know, I'm Brian Gregory. I'm the president of Aldridge. Welcome, everyone, to our next webinar in our series that we've been doing over the last probably year and a half now. We've brought some good content over the year around cybersecurity and some other topics. And the feedback we get from you guys is you want to hear more about how you can protect yourself. And so today we're joined by a few other experts in their fields. Michael McLaughlin of Buchanan and Corey Huey from Higginbotham. We also have a standby presenter, Gray Holden with Higginbotham, because Corey at any moment is going to get a new addition to his family. So if you see Corey disappear, it is because his wife is saying, let's go to the hospital. So Corey, I appreciate you joining us today with that added stress in your life. We also have our resident technology expert on everything technology, Chad Hyatt, our CIO. Welcome back, Chad. With that, I will turn it over to Michael. I'll pop off video. If I come back, I've got questions from the audience. If not, I will see you guys at the end of the webinar.
Hey, thanks so much, Brian. I really appreciate it. Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Mike McLaughlin. I'm the co-leader of the Cybersecurity and Data Privacy Practice Group at Buchanan, Ingersoll, and Rooney. For your overall threat update, we wanted to talk through some of the biggest things that organizations across every industry are facing. But first, we wanted to talk a little bit about the drivers as well. Cybercrime, ransomware, business email compromise, targeting of critical infrastructure, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It doesn't exist purely for financial gain or purely for a criminal enterprise. It all rolls up and falls under certain geopolitical drivers and certain instances and certain things that are occurring globally as well as here at home. And these are the types of things that we need to be aware of. In 2022, there was a lull in ransomware. That lull coincided with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The reason being was because there were a lot of cyber actors who were focusing their efforts rather than on Western business interests on Ukraine and vice versa. As 2022 drew to a close and sanctions really started to bite on the Russian economy, Russia's IT workers and their workforce, which is fairly sophisticated, suddenly found themselves in a pinch. Well, Russian IT workers generally are not going to be panhandling in the streets of Moscow or St. Petersburg. They're going to turn to something that's a little bit more lucrative. And when the Russian government says that they are not going to turn over these individuals or these ransomware groups to Western law enforcement, that only further incentivizes them to conduct activities. As a result, in 2023 and thus far in 2024, we've seen an explosion in ransomware, as well as increasing costs. In 2021, the cost of ransomware was roughly $25 billion globally. By 2031, we expect that to explode to $265 billion. That's something that is an unprecedented rise in any sort of crime in history. And so this is something that we very much need to be aware of. The geopolitical drivers are going to continue to push ransomware, and so organizations of all sizes and in every industry need to prepare accordingly. But ransomware isn't the only issue. Business email compromise is another critical vulnerability and critical threat that companies face. Business email compromise works by targeting the weakest element of any organization. Of course, that's the human. It works through social engineering. I'm not going to steal Chad's thunder. He's going to go into this a little bit later. But suffice it to say that business email compromise is a very real concern, and things as simple as processes, policies, procedures, and training can forestall the vast majority of business email compromises, which since 2013 has resulted in over $51 billion worth of damages. The next thing that we are going to talk about and that we need to consider on the global stage, and this is something that is actually really, really pertinent because just this morning, Verizon, T-Mobile, and AT&T all reported wide outages to their network infrastructure. This is coming on the heels of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, FBI, and NSA issuing a joint disclosure of Chinese cyber actors targeting U.S. critical infrastructure, primarily telecommunications. There hasn't been a direct tie to this, but this is one of the geopolitical drivers and some of the very real impact that we have to critical infrastructure, and that there are certain companies in certain industries that need to be even more keenly aware because they are absolutely being targeted by nation states for the purposes of either espionage or cyber warfare. And then finally, the threats that we really need to look at right now are those that I talked about. But over the horizon, the threats are increasing exponentially. And of course, I'm talking about the advent of artificial intelligence. Certainly, AI is going to bring tools that are going to assist our net defenders and assist cybersecurity, but it's also going to enable cyber actors, malicious actors, to more effectively conduct their operations through social engineering, through tailored spear phishing, through deepfakes. These are all areas that we need to be aware of and make sure that we are positioning ourselves and ensuring that we are prepared now and going into the future. With that, I'll turn it over to Corey to finish up the threat update.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I think you need. Corey Huey, I'm the cyber practice leader over at Higginbotham, and what I really wanted to kind of hit on everybody with the threat update is that thought process of, am I a target, I'm not a target, or I am a target. And the best analogy I can kind of give to this, and I'll explain it a little bit more in depth, is threat actors using the scanning tools that they use are like the ocean trawlers that are fishing with massive nets. And those nets, are 400, 500 feet long, and they drop down, 100, 200 feet in the water. And anything that's caught in that net is what they're going after. So I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're a specific target or not. And these threat actors, I mean, a threat actor could be a 15-year-old kid, just down the street from you, that's able to get these scanning tools that he learned about through a Reddit thread. So he just learns about it on a forum, and then he's able to get a direction as to how to go get these tools. They're sophisticated tools, but they're actually very simple to get. And so that mindset of, I'm not a target, has become irrelevant, because essentially everybody's a target. And I mean, we see on the insurance side, we see losses day in, day out. And it's all from that kind of the mindset of, oh, I'm not a target. So what I really just want to drive in is, everybody is a target. I mean, that's the key. And so with that, I'll kick it over to Chad.
Actually, I'm going to have Mike run through a couple of cases that he's seen, and then I'll share from the IT perspective another case that we've seen for cybersecurity, just try to land this.
Certainly. And so to just really drive home the doom and gloom for everybody, I'll walk through two cases, and then Chad's got one as well. But what Corey's talking about is really critical to understand, in that a lot of cases, threat actors are looking for targets of opportunity. In very few cases, they actually are going whaling, in which case they're looking for very large targets for very big payoffs. But threat actors typically aren't trying to go after the hardened target. If you are Goldman Sachs or if you are PNC Bank, you have very good cybersecurity because you're in the financial sector and you have a lot of losses, or you have the potential for a lot of losses. As a result, it's much harder to penetrate. Whereas if you're in the startup, or if you are a startup or a smaller business, the chances of you having that type of cybersecurity is pretty low. However, there are companies across every industry in the IT sector that are dealing with data, that data is incredibly valuable. And so those are the types of companies that threat actors are looking for credentials just very broadly, and then are spraying, and we're using a shotgun approach to identify who's vulnerable, where can they access. And even beyond that, ransomware actors are no longer just individual groups that are conducting these operations as unitary entities. They use ransomware as a service model, where you've got individual elements that are conducting different portions of the attack kill chain. And so you'll have access agents who are specializing in going after specific, or specializing in penetrating the network, whether that's through social engineering, whether that's through credentials, whether it's through brute force attacks. Then they hand that over to other elements of the group who are more equipped to do things like administrative tasks using Windows or Linux or Mac, to move laterally to identify the specific areas of that network that they want to capture because it's the most lucrative data. Then you have the ransomware tool developers who are actually developing the encryption that's being used in those algorithms that is being deployed by these threat actors. And on the back end, you have a whole service industry that deals directly with communication with victims and facilitation of Bitcoin payments and other cryptocurrency, so that organizations can get their data back. But this whole ecosystem is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's going to continue to grow. And so what Corey was talking about, that it's not a matter of if, but when. And it's because you have this very large industry that is going after companies and organizations essentially indiscriminately. So for the first case we'll talk about, and I'll go through this relatively quickly, but I want to get just the basic gist. Black Hat is one of the most sophisticated ransomware groups that we've seen, also one of the most pernicious. The reason being is because they use that ransomware as a service model to target organizations of all sizes, but primarily they're going after lucrative targets. And so one of my clients is an IT service provider in the financial sector. Black Cat was able to get unauthorized access via what we believe social engineering. They were able to get the credentials of an admin. They then were able to move laterally through the network, immediately encrypting data centers because they knew exactly where the data was that they were looking for, and they were able to pass it off to very sophisticated administrators. But then they were able to swim downstream to the banks and financial institutions that this service provider provided services to and encrypted their devices. So immediately, it wasn't just this organization who was able to contain it and control the line of communication. Immediately, they had to go into crisis communications mode. They had to bring all of their customers in, do regular updates, regular communication, all to forestall liability on the back end. They had to make sure that they were providing the right communications, they were providing the right incentives, they were being very open and forthright with the forensics investigation, so that the customers, their vendors, their clients were all aware and were put at ease that my client, had everything well in hand. And they did. But even at that, they were able to stop the spread of the ransomware. They were able to stop the encryption. They didn't have to pay. They worked very closely with the FBI. Even at that, it still cost nearly $2 million to completely recover from this incident. And that's without paying the ransom. That's with having a great cybersecurity team. So this can be extremely expensive, and these groups are very sophisticated and very capable. Go to the next slide. Another example of this is Scattered Spider. Scattered Spider is an affiliate of the Black Hat ransomware group, and they're most well known, at least most recently, for the MGM Casino and Resort compromise that cost MGM about $110 million. This all occurred for MGM through social engineering of the help desk. I had a similar client who you will never hear about because they were able to forestall any of these damages that MGM suffered. And the reason being was because they were able to identify the vulnerability, able to identify the anomalous activity very early and cut it off. But even at that, the threat actor was still able to move through the network, was still able to exfiltrate data through a third-party data hosting service that my client didn't even use, and then to extort or to attempt to extort financial or to extort funds from my client. The reason why they were successful was because they were able to identify it so early on. They had MDR, they had XDR. They brought in the right DFIR firm very early. They brought in a very effective attorney very early on. They coordinated and communicated with their insurance carrier. But everything they did was following their incident response plan. It was by the book. This was another incident that cost roughly $1.5 million. But they didn't have to pay. And for this client, they had roughly $35 billion in annual revenue. This is a situation where this was a very low impact event where it otherwise could have been something very significant like MGM. Chad, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. I'll talk through one of these where those two cases were great, and there's certainly a technical element to both of those cases, but it's important from a security perspective to also understand that cybersecurity is as much about your culture and your preparedness and your business processes as it is about the layers of technology and tools that you put around it. We helped a healthcare provider go through a cybersecurity investigation, worked with their insurer, got the details about it, but the net result of this is that the threat actor didn't actually target the business specifically. They successfully compromised one of the vendors of the business. And that vendor, we don't have any control of the security of that vendor. They were able to compromise the email account of one of those vendors, and they moved throughout that environment and realized, I've got now access to the mailbox of one of the invoicing clerks. And I can follow the chain, and maybe I can ride along in the environment, and I can realize, oh, I'm regularly sending invoices of substantial amounts or reasonable amounts that a threat actor would be attracted to over to the actual targeted business now. The targeted business in this case was our client. Still is our client. We were able to navigate through this. The threat actor masquerading as the invoicing clerk actually modified invoices and then modified it on the invoicing clerk's mailbox such that the invoicing clerk could not tell that new email was going out within their account. And they, of course, put new routing information and sent that along. The only thing that flowed into the targeted business's environment was the email. There's nothing necessarily threatening about that. The content in it didn't have a malicious payload, but it was a social engineering attack. And they're trying to get the payroll or the AP clerk inside the targeted business to change routing information. And they already had a policy and a procedure for that, and that it required a two-person check. So the AP clerk looked at it and said, okay, it's a routing check. The supervisor looked at it, said, yes, it's a routing check. But because of all the other things about social engineering and that it came from a trusted account, they both decided to trust it. And so they went ahead and changed the routing information and paid an invoice. And then a few minutes later realized we should have called the vendor. And so they start that process and they realize, okay, we actually ended up being socially engineered, we ended up routing funds, but because of the culture of the targeted business and the security awareness that they'd put in place, the leadership within the targeted business actually used the case to further drive the point about here's why we're vigilant. They were able to work with their insurance provider. They were able to use an incident response team. We were able to put the complete story together. They were actually able to recover the funds. So the threat actor in this case didn't profit. They managed to work with the Secret Service and the international banking community and freeze it before it was able to be transferred to the threat actor. But really the story here is that security awareness is part of the culture of the organization, and the leadership drives that culture. And even when a security event or a security incident does occur, you're able to use that and say, this is why we do what we do, and you're able to reinforce your processes along the way. That's all to say that security, and when we're talking about cybersecurity, it's not about avoiding all attacks. It just isn't feasible. The goal of security and cybersecurity is to be resilient. You want to be able to survive the attacks, recover from the attacks, minimize the damage from the attacks, and continue being able to do business and do what you guys do. From a resilient standpoint, there's this concept of left of boom, right of boom, and you might be familiar with those 5 steps in that timeline across the top. That's part of the NIST cybersecurity framework that a lot of security people subscribe to. The idea that you have to identify, know what's in your environment. You put layers of protection around the assets that are in your environment. And then between protection and detection, if you detect something that's unusual, you then have a process to go into response and recovery. So you have both this concept of structural awareness, that's just housekeeping, maintenance, making sure that you understand what's in your environment and the layers of protection you have around it, but also situational awareness. And when we're talking incident response plans, we're really talking activating that situational awareness. What starts the process? How do you start flowing through that? And as a business, from a resilience standpoint, you have to consider both. Now, identify, protect, respond, and recover. Really, we're talking about protecting the assets that are inside your business. And I'll talk from the technology perspective. I know Mike and Corey can certainly talk at a higher degree on the business impacts that they've seen with the organizations that they've worked with. But when we think of assets from an IT perspective, we're thinking of the devices, all the physical equipment, things that you care about, from the workstations to the servers to the cloud assets. We're thinking about applications. We're thinking about the networks, the communication between those devices, and the information, the data that you have, the confidential information, the proprietary information, the customer information, the financial information, and then the users, the identities that people have. And all of these things, this whole process about building resilience has, towards the left side of things, you can leverage a lot of technology to be able to manage those things. But towards the right side of things, when you're going into detect, respond, and recover, you need to be able to leverage expertise and have the right team standing by to be able to respond to that event in real time, because the threat actors, to Mike's earlier point, to Corey's earlier point, they're pretty aggressive. They know at least as much as we do, and they have a head start. So it takes smart people sometimes to fight smart people that are trying to do harm to your business. And all of this is on a foundation of processes. So we start putting in tools to identify and protect and provide sensors if something looks weird. So you might deploy one tool. Mike mentioned MDR, Managed Detection and Response earlier, and it might provide some of those tools for some of those boxes. But you also should be thinking there's no one tool that's going to protect everything. You've got to do a layered defense with the idea that even if I can't protect everything with one thing, I can use several things that complement each other. And now a threat that's coming through has a very high likelihood of being detected or even blocked by one or more of those layers. So the map might look something like this, and this is just an abstraction on it, where you're using a mix of technology, people, and processes to conscientiously decide Where's my risk? What are the assets I need to protect? How can I best protect them and be prepared to respond? Now, the goal on this, and it might be tempting to fill in every single block on here, the goal is not to play blackout. Aldridge primarily provides IT outsourcing and co-managed in the small and mid-sized business space. A lot of the tools that are capable of filling in more and more of those blocks were enterprise space, even just 3 to 5 years ago. We're seeing the market mature and shift so that more and more of those tools become available to small and mid-sized businesses. It's not going to be cost effective for you to put the ultra high grade enterprise level tools in for every organization, but you might not have that same level of risk. You want to be able to make informed choices to balance what tools, people, and processes are right for your organization and your culture. So some of those fundamental layers, like from a technology perspective, what do we have for backup and recovery readiness? Do we have email and internet threat filtering? Do we have managed detection and response? All the way down the list. From a people standpoint, who's minding the indicators? Do you have an IT team that understands your environment, that's prepared to respond? Do you have a cybersecurity insurer? Do you have an attorney? Do you have all these things lined up such that if you do have to start going through detect, respond, recover, you don't have to scramble at that particular moment to say, what should we do now? The building's on fire, now's not the time to come up with a fire escape plan. You want to have that ahead of time. That's your processes portion here, which we're going to be talking about what an incident response plan looks like. I'm going to turn this back over to Corey for a second because I want him to talk about the importance of insurance in this from a cybersecurity perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Chad. So I'm sure, as everybody knows, we don't really have a federal regulation. We have some states that are in the process of implementing cybersecurity regulation or data privacy regulation across the U.S. But for the most part, what's really driving this market is going to be the commercial market as a whole, kind of the banks, the big private equity groups that we mentioned before, as well as the cyber insurance market, which is really starting to drive the implementation of cybersecurity and cyber insurance across the board. Kind of the state of the market that we're looking at right now, I'm sure everybody remembers after COVID when cyber insurance was a hot topic. We saw tons and tons of activity as everybody went remote, and essentially we saw that hockey stick of, frequency and severity of cyber events. Well, the cyber insurance market never truly found an equilibrium because of cyber risk itself, being that it is incredibly volatile. It's the nature of loss from a frequency and severity standpoint is all across the board. So something that's kind of driving it is ransomware, as Mike was discussing the increase in ransomware activity. The figure, I can't remember exactly, but I know it was in the last quarter of last year, we saw more ransomware payouts than all of 2022. And we're already seeing the exact same activity today. So, I mean, we're already seeing more activity, threat activity that's increasing. And the reason for that is kind of like Mike touched on in his threat is the AI. So, I mean, as much as everybody knows, ChatGPT is this awesome tool. AI is changing everything. It's revolutionary. Well, the advent of AI for good and efficiency is also being used maliciously. So, I mean, another analogy I like to kind of use so people understand is, that same 15-year-old hacker we talked about down the street, he still has to eat and sleep, and he can only make, 100 attempts on your network in a day. AI doesn't eat, it doesn't sleep, and it can make 1,000 attempts in an hour. So, I mean, this is what we're looking at. And so that activity is increasing the market's hardness, which means it's going to be harder for companies to acquire new cyber insurance, and underwriters are going to place a ton of scrutiny on not only your cybersecurity controls, like the technology that Chad's talking about, but they're even more so this year, they're going to be heavily looking into policies and procedures, which one of the most critical ones that we've hit time and time again is the incident response planning. I'm going to have a slide that pops up after this, but something that is very important to understand is there are new definitions in insurance, and a lot of these definitions for cyber are focusing on war and cyber war and systemic attacks. And the reason for that is exactly everything that Mike hit on in the beginning, which is the current state of geopolitics in total, right? I mean, the entire world is in a a little bit more of a agitated, aggressive state right now. Some other items that we're really starting to see within the cyber insurance are like the contractual requirements we're seeing from all of our clients, our vendors, our partners, that they're sending us their contracts, and they're all showing, that they have a cyber insurance requirement in there, whether it's $1 million for a standard service agreement, or if you're a oil field operator out in Midland and the operator is wanting to see, a $10 million policy, even for a welder, right? So we're seeing these pop up more and more. Another item, and I'm going to have Mike jump on this because we have a mutual interest in this next one, is we're seeing some more severe indemnification clauses. And when I say severe, there's a little bit of overreach that's going on, and Mike will hit a little bit more, but they are focused on cybersecurity, data privacy, but even more so particularly on like the business email compromise and the fraudulent wire transfers. I'll let Mike kind of jump in on that.
Hey, I'm sorry, Corey. You caught me mid-cough. My 5-year-old brought something home from kindergarten. So from the business email compromise aspect, and I actually wanted to go back to something that Chad hit on, and Chad talked a little bit about people, processes, and technology. We always bid it into these three because there really is no one silver bullet when it comes to cybersecurity. You can have all the technology in the world, and the human can still be targeted. And what I mean by that is, let's say as a hypothetical, and this is a real world example of business email compromise, but as a hypothetical, you are a company and you deal with invoices on a regular basis. You get an email from someone that has a very similar email address to your client or to one of your vendors or your attorney for that matter. So Buchanan, our domain is bipc.com. But what if you got an email that was spoofing our domain, just said biipc.com? Everything else looked the same signature block, coming from someone who you knew to have been in correspondence with your company. And they said, we need you to change the wire information. And then somebody within your organization, this is textbook social engineering, but somebody within your organization does that. There is no technical solution for it. There are policies, there are procedures that you can put in place requiring two-factor authentication and I don't mean multi-factor authentication. I actually mean somebody to come in and say, yes, that looks good, and give a thumbs up, requiring out-of-band communication with the person who initiated that request through a phone number or through a separate line of communication than the email was sent to verify that they are who they say they are. And then just general training of your personnel. But if that gets through, it's not a technology that's going to protect you. It's going to be the people and processes. And how well do you prepare your people? And how well do you ensure that your processes are effective against these emerging threats? This is something that as you look across the full gamut, the full spectrum of threats, they're constantly evolving. You need to make sure that the training that you're giving to your personnel and that the policies and procedures that you're writing are sufficient to handle these threats. And at the same time, technology is key. You need to make sure the technology that's in your stack that's specific to cybersecurity is pacing the technology that the threat actors are using. It is pacing those threats. So really bringing in the people, processes, and technology is critically important, and it cannot just be one.
And the kind of last piece that we're seeing pop up now from a directors and officers standpoint is our companies ensuring that their chief information security officers are being indemnified, because we're seeing a lot of language and we're seeing some instances. I think a really famous one, if anybody has paid attention to the ongoing SolarWinds debacle, that the SEC personally went after SolarWinds CISO. So it brought about the question, are your chief information security officers being indemnified? Are they actually being viewed as a director and officer, so that if you are carrying director and officer insurance, that you have something there to give them assurance? You can go on to the next slide. This next slide, I just want to let everybody take a minute to just read the war exclusion. This is from a very large insurer that handles an immense amount of business. They are a kind of name basis insurer. So the gist of this sample war exclusion, and I want to highlight a couple key words here is you'll see where they says or warlike operations, right? Whether a war is declared or not, that is key, right? So they're saying like Congress doesn't have to say that there's a declared state of war to trigger this. It's a little bit more broad. So this is an example of it that I just wanted everybody to see that when you read it, you could understand it wouldn't be too hard to trigger this. And we've already seen some spillover from the Israeli and Palestinian war, where there were, I think, Mike correct me on this, I think there were Iranian actors that were targeting an Israeli entity that had activity inside the U.S. And so warlike activities actually spilled over to the U.S.
So this was actually the Aliquippa water treatment facility in western Pennsylvania was using Israeli software, and they were targeted by an Iranian proxy group as a result of that, because the Iranian proxy group said that they were going to target anyone that was doing business with or utilizing Israeli services and software. And so this would be a situation where potentially an insurer could deny coverage simply because something that is occurring on the other side of the world had a tangential impact or tangential driver for a cyber incident that affected a business in the US. We saw this also back in 2017 is really where this all stemmed from, which was the NotPetya attack, where elements of the Russian government targeted critical infrastructure within Ukraine through a tax service that spilled out and caused about $10 billion worth of damages globally, including Mondelez and AP Moller Maersk. Well, Mondelez tried to get coverage from Zurich, their insurer. Zurich denied coverage, and it ended up being a prolonged lawsuit wherein Mondelez finally got the coverage, but it required a significant amount of outlay of funds on their part for legal services so that they could fight for the coverage that they had paid for.
So just the key takeaways is like the likelihood of this being used in the current state of the world a little bit higher than we'd all be comfortable them being. And, just really important to know that that you have cybersecurity in place, you have a framework in place, because in the event that this exclusion is triggered, the only thing that's there to really cover you is the cybersecurity that you have in place.
Towards that point, when we start talking about incident response plans, I want to walk through a little bit of vocabulary from a cybersecurity perspective, and I'll differentiate between security events, security incidents, and security breaches, because you'll hear in popular media, all three of those are used interchangeably. Some of them are more inflammatory than others, but also think about how you talk about this internally within your organization. Just be aware, security events are normal. They occur all the time. If I log into a system and I'm permitted to do so, that's a security event. It logs activity. If I access content or update a document, that's a security event. If I log into the accounting system, security event. I make a change to an entry inside of a transaction processing system that I'm privileged to access, security event. The security team that you've put in place, the process and the people and the tools element of it, they're watching for security indicators. And security indicators are unusual activity that level of situational awareness, the structural awareness that you have in your environment is saying, this looks like it needs further scrutiny. This looks like it needs further scrutiny because it's different than what our normal behavior looks like. So the security team's job is to then say, okay, great, let's start going through investigation. We've detected something. Let's start responding and recovering. But they have to inform. They have to start that incident response process. That incident response process is a business level decision. Specifically, security incidents and security breaches shouldn't be the domain of the security team to declare. The security team can say, we think we have a possible incident going. That should start your incident response plan. That should get the appropriate people notified. They should be part of that. But ultimately, whether something is a security incident or a security breach has to be a leadership determination, because that has business implications for your organization. We still want the security team to start going through response and recovery appropriate to what your incident response plan dictates they should be doing. But just be aware, from a terminology standpoint, you wouldn't want someone inside your organization to say, oh, I just got a phishing email, we've got a security breach. It wouldn't make sense. Imagine somebody getting on social media that sits next to them saying, oh, there's a security breach going on inside my company. That's how quickly that terminology could get out of control, and it can have downstream impacts for you. when we're
Chad, if I
talking,
could jump,
go ahead, Mike.
I can jump in really quick. I know this might seem like semantics to a lot of people, and like attorneys, we're word people, right? Words matter for attorneys. Well, in this case, they really matter. And the reason they really matter is because as soon as anybody within your organization starts calling something a security incident or a security breach via any sort of correspondence, whether it's email or Slack or Teams or Signal or whatever, that information, those correspondence, that's discoverable in the event of a suit that follows a breach. And if suddenly somebody within your organization is saying, well, we have a security incident days or weeks before the organization officially declares it, then you could have a plaintiff saying, well, look, organization, general counsel, CEO, someone within your organization knew that this was a security incident and you didn't. Clearly, that's a communication problem. You're still going to be liable for declaring that incident when your team first started talking about it. Similarly, if you've got the SEC coming after you, if you're a publicly traded company, that's really going to kick off or be very indicative of the materiality of the cyber incident. If your team is calling it a security incident or a security breach very early on, that really is going to kickstart when that materiality review and when that cyber incident is going to be determined to be a material cyber incident, after which you have 4 days to report to the SEC or to file an 8K saying we suffered a material breach. But these time windows, these timelines are entirely predicated on what seem to be semantics. So this part is really, really important. And Chad, as a non-attorney, I'm glad you picked that up.
Thanks, Mike. You said it better than I could. So when we're talking about security events, indicators, incidents, and breaches, what we're really talking about is, do you have one of your assets within your organization that's been compromised? And we've been using the term compromise, or you've seen that on some of the examples. And really, we're talking about three key things. The confidentiality has been violated, the availability of it has been violated, or the integrity of it has been violated. Any of those three things, that's what the threat actor is then going to try to leverage to either get money or cause harm or cause further damage or use it as a stepping stone, move on to the next thing. So when you're thinking about what's valuable inside your business that you need to put these layers of protection around, be thinking about the assets that you have and what would happen if the confidentiality was violated or the availability was violated or the integrity was violated. Wrapping all that up, a security incident response plan is that business level plan to say, when we see these types of indicators and we don't have a benign explanation for it, or we're starting to even investigate this category of indicators because of the potential risk, the incident response plan kicks in and it starts to dictate who, what, when, where, how are we going to respond to this, who's in charge, how do we do it. What's important on this is that the incident response plan actually starts during the current investigation of the security event. When it suggests that an asset compromise could be occurring or has occurred, you want to get the people on your team, get that expertise mobilized as soon as you believe, yep, this could be happening right now. We don't have a benign explanation for it. Let's actually treat it as if it would potentially develop into an incident or breach. Let's start collecting what we need to have so that we can respond appropriately, maintain that resiliency, minimize the damage, and return to a normal business operating state. The things that go into an effective security response plan, and I know Corey and Mike are both going to have a lot to add on these, but think about this as a collaborative effort between your leadership team and your technical teams and your legal teams and your insurer. You want to think about, what do you consider a security incident for your business? And honestly, your insurance might dictate what that is based on the choices that you've made. You might have regulatory requirements similar to what Mike has called out that define what is a security incident and who's got the authority to determine it. You want to establish the roles and responsibilities in the plan. Very frequently, I've seen incident response plans go all the way down to the individual person at the individual desk, that original AP clerk, saying, if you're the first person that thinks that there is a security event happening, you have an obligation to be able to raise that to the next authority's attention. But until they acknowledge and they've got the ball, you've got the ball. Let's keep this thing rolling. We don't want time to pass and say, oh, well, it's probably nothing. It might not be nothing. Let's go ahead and get the incident response plan rolling. I'm going to turn this over to Corey, who I know can speak to some of the things very specific in the insurance industry on incident response plans.
Yeah, so what's critical is, if you hold a current cyber insurance policy, you need to know there's essentially two people that you need to call in the event that you have a breach or a security incident. That's going to be, you're going to need to notify your agent because they're going to do their due diligence to follow up with the insurer. But on most of your insurance policies, there's a page on there that says, in the event that something happens, here is the number to call. So you have two. So I mean, you can notify the agent who's going to make that notification, or you can call yourself. So during that event, any notes that you have on the breach are going to be critical to how the insurance reacts. So I mean, you need to start taking note of everything as it's taking place. And then kind of that same idea, I mean, with all of us here on the Gulf Coast that deal with hurricanes, we know that dealing with a storm coming in, that if you have a hole in your roof because of the storm, the insurance companies do want you to throw a tarp up over it so that you can begin to mitigate the losses. Well, it's the same thing with cyber insurance. In the event that a breach occurs, they want you to, remove everybody from the system, secure the network, and assess the damages. And then like something critical that's been touched on numerous times is that managed detection and response. And the insurers actually have a statistic that if you have MDR in place, MDR policies, procedures, and technology in place, that they will be able to respond 50% faster. So I mean, in this situation, time is money. And I mean, as we've all kind of said, time, it's essential that you respond as quickly as can be. And with that, I'll kick it over to Mike.
And so here are some things as you build out your incident response plan, things to start considering. First and foremost, understanding what your risk is. And so every incident response plan is going to be tailored to an individual organization. It's going to be tailored to your needs. In your incident response plan, if the first thing is, hey, I see an anomaly, you need to call the CISO, but you don't have a phone on your desk, well, it's not going to work. You need to make sure that you have things that fit your organization. And so making sure that it's tailored, making sure that it's something that's practical and useful is really, really important. But to that end, you also have to be able to identify what are the critical assets, what are also the critical business operations, business functions that need to come online very quickly. Because it's not just about responding to the incident, figuring out the root cause of the damage, doing the notifications. Ultimately, it's the business. If the business doesn't come back after the breach, any sort of response that you're doing is essentially for naught. So everything you do really has to be with your business in mind and making sure that you can stay resilient. On top of that, you have to look at what are your regulatory obligations. This is going to come from your industry specifically. In some cases, we've seen that regulatory obligations are overlapping and duplicative. And so you may be doing the same reporting requirement for your state that you're doing for the SEC, that you're doing for the Department of Defense, that you're doing for Health and Human Services. And that's okay, but recognize that though you have those obligations very early on and know what the time windows are for each one, because every single state has a different time window for notification. Same with all of the different federal regulators. Some of them are from the date that the breach occurred. Some of them are from the date of the identification of the breach. Some of them are from the date that the data was actually identified as having been breached. Understanding what those timelines are is critically important. And then you get into your industry-specific considerations. And we talked a little bit about the AT&T, T-Mobile, Verizon breach earlier. If you're in critical infrastructure, recognize that you are going to be targeted by a nation state. And whether it's probing or for espionage or for a full-on cyber attack, we know that nation states are targeting elements of critical infrastructure. How are you factoring that into your plan? Because if there's a motivated and well-funded nation state actor, the ability for the vast majority of companies to be able to withstand that is almost none. So how do you respond? How do you stay resilient? How do you ensure that business continuity continues and you have the right connections within the federal government that when you need to raise your hand and say, I need an adult, the federal government is going to come in and assist when it's a nation state. And then the final aspect of this is from a contractual perspective. Above and beyond your regulatory obligations, your statutory obligations, you have individual agreements with every one of your vendors, with every one of your clients. In a lot of cases, those individual agreements are going to stipulate that you have to notify them of any security breach to your network within a certain time frame. Make sure you're standardizing those agreements, standardizing those contracts where you're able to, and where you're not, recognize the fact that those timelines exist and make sure that you're meeting it so that you're not in breach of contract ultimately leading to liability or additional liability after the breach. Next slide.
Brian, I saw you pop in there. Do we have a question on this one?
We do. So I have a question. If a business has a business email compromised and there's no financial loss, do they still need to notify their cyber insurance company? And if so, what information are they required to provide?
So I can give you the answer from the legal perspective. Corey, do you want to touch on the insurance side first?
I mean, yeah, from the insurance side, there's that the insurer has a whole clause built into every single policy about a reasonable time of making them aware. So if you don't make them aware and that grows and it becomes a financial loss, they will have grounds to decline coverage. So kind of the best case scenario is you can make them aware without making a claim. So it's just, keeping them on the forefront.
Yeah. And my response to that is twofold, one from the legal side and one from the insurance side. From the legal side, if you have a business email compromise, it's not always that they're going to result in wire fraud. The business email compromise may be used as a hot point in order to set up an account somewhere else so that someone can steal your identity and utilize you as a mule for money laundering for a much larger wire fraud scheme. So those are the types of things you want to be aware of, is why is somebody accessing my email? The other aspect of it is, what are they accessing? Because a lot of laws, there are two different ways that states look at breaches. It's either an unauthorized party accessed your data or accessed and acquired your data. And this is critically important, because if somebody just accessed your data, that means they looked at it. If you can definitively say through forensics, through log analysis, that somebody looked at the data and you're in one of those states, or the individual whose data was compromised is a resident of one of those states, you have a notification obligation as soon as that data is accessed. If it's an acquired state, then unless it gets exfiltrated, you don't need to notify. But that's really important. For the insurance side of that is, the only way that you know that is if you do the forensics and you actually go through the logs. Well, if you have insurance that covers the response, that DFIR work, to go through the logs, you're going to want to report it to insurance so that you can get money back for doing the forensics, even if there is no financial loss. And so from the legal side, I would always say, if you identify that there's been a business email compromise, you immediately want to do the log analysis. If you have cyber insurance, or even if you don't, you want to notify your carrier to let them know that it occurred, to see if you have coverage and ensure that you're meeting your regulatory or statutory obligations.
Is there any downside to doing the notification?
Is there any downside? Yeah, the risk of lawsuit. But ultimately, a lot of companies, you don't have a choice. It's whenever there is a statutory obligation, and if you choose not to, you're accepting the risk that either the state attorney general that is the responsible state attorney general is going to file suit against you for being in violation of the state law, or if it's a larger breach, that you could potentially be facing a class action. And so there are companies that say, we are going to do a risk of harm analysis, and we're going to take a risk-based approach, and we are not going to notify because it's going to be too expensive. And you can do that, just like you cannot pay your taxes. But that's a risk that you're taking.
I think it's important to note here too, on what Mike's saying is, being any of the companies that are on here listening today, being in domiciled in Texas or a resident of Texas, we've gone for a little while without any state laws that were directly focused on cybersecurity. Well, all that's changing. If you haven't been made aware, everybody should heavily look into the Texas Data Privacy Cybersecurity Law that goes into effect July 1st, because it is a stringent law, and it's actually going to, if I've read it correctly, it's actually going to be stricter in some cases than California's CCPA, which was the first state to really set precedents in this. So mark your calendars, July 1, you're going to have more state regulatory compliance requirements dictated by the state of Texas. So that is critical to know.
And importantly on that, it is going to apply to anyone who does business in Texas. There are no thresholds. So strap in.
Let me dovetail into that. So as we're talking about building these incident response plans and thinking about what do we have inside our environment that we would most care about if the confidentiality or integrity or availability was at risk, This is as much a technical exercise of understanding what's in your IT environment, what is your cybersecurity landscape, as it is a business exercise. Notice the last thing on this list I've got under data, like customer financial info, high confidentiality, high integrity requirement, medium availability risk. If it wasn't available for a day, we could probably still do what we need to do. If it wasn't available for a month, it would start to really hurt, and probably even a week, it would start to hurt. But if the confidentiality was violated, if it was exfiltrated, or the data was changed purposefully to be deceptive, both of those would present potentially a high risk in this sort of scenario. Thinking through the assets that you have inside your environment then lets you call out what's high risk, what's low risk, because your incident response plan, part of it, you can help define to all the team members involved. We consider this asset to be critical because of this. We consider this is not a significant event because of this. The risk is low. And you have to think through, what does a confidentiality or an integrity or an availability violation look like for each one of those? And you can use that to steer your business decisions about what is your degree of response to the developing scenario that you've got an indicator about, that your team is telling you about. From a recovery standpoint, I'll talk from a technical perspective. Really, it's about resiliency. It's restoring the operations, but it's also about understanding the full story. The best security event is one that was avoided. It didn't happen. The second best security event is the one where you've got a complete timeline. You know, the threat actor did this first, then they did this, then they did this, then they did this, they touched this, they looked at this, they exfiltrated this, they modified this system. All of these things have been restored back to a trusted state, and there's a story to it. The hardest ones, and the ones that occur more frequently, where you don't have all of those appropriate layers of protection, the teams, the processes in place, you detect it some percentage of the way into the attack, but you don't know what happened prior to that. And you never have a way of 100% being certain what happened before it. It's based on what everybody can see in the moment. So it's very important to have those layers of protection before a threat occurs, so that you can bring the whole story together, which makes all the other conversations that Corey and Mike were talking about much easier. And then you want to reestablish those trusts, or reestablish trust in the compromised assets. I saw one of the things in an earlier slide, I think it was Corey's, one of the things the insurer wants you to do is get the environment back down to a small trusted state, kick people out of the environment, preserve the state, preserve the evidence. In order to do business, people have to be in the environment. So you've got to reestablish trust in the compromised assets in a meaningful, measured way, in collaboration with all the other expert teams that are involved in this. Corey, I think I'm queuing you up to talk about this from an insurance perspective.
Yeah. So what does the recovery look like from an insurance perspective? It's going to be a very complex process, but it's going to be mostly the insurer is going to take the reins. And funny enough, the insurer is typically going to use a guy like Mike. They're typically going to have one of their attorney panelists that leads the charge, and that breach coach, as a lot of them are called, are going to pull all the appropriate levers. They're going to be the ones engaging the crisis management teams, the public relations team, the IT forensics, and then providing all the other legal support. So that is going to be the process in which the insurance reacts. Now, one thing that is very critical, and it's come up before, I've actually sat in meetings about this, is that the insurance is going to make you monetarily whole again, right? It is going to do its best to restore you back to right before that attack happened. Those insurance limits that you're paying premium dollars for, they cannot be used to augment or upgrade your current cybersecurity or IT framework. I mean, they are only there to make you whole again. So I think it's critical that everybody understands that.
Mike, how about from a legal perspective? What's recovery look like?
Not getting sued. Now, from a legal perspective, honestly, it's meeting those regulatory, statutory obligations, and then ensuring that you're not in breach of contract, or if you are, or if there is any sort of suit on the back end, that you put yourself in a defensible position very early on. The ways that you do this are, again, I talked a little bit about understanding what all your timelines are, understanding what your notification requirements are. That is certainly important. Make sure you hit those time wickets and those time windows. The other aspect is, if you work with law enforcement, and a lot of people say, if I get breached, I don't want to work with law enforcement because if I'm in critical infrastructure, it might raise the specter of liability. I always encourage clients to work with the FBI or to work with the Secret Service, especially in event of business email compromise or ransomware. For business email compromise, the Secret Service can get the money back when The banks themselves can't do it. They can stop and they can freeze the transfers. They have that ability. The FBI, it works regularly on developing decryptors for encrypted information that are resulting from ransomware. I'm also working with the FBI on a separate case where they're able to go and reach out overseas to our partners and seize data that is being stored in cloud service providers overseas. So partnering with the FBI, partnering with federal law enforcement can be a huge value add. The other value add there is almost every single state permits an extension of their time window if you are involved in a federal law enforcement investigation. And if you're supporting the FBI and cooperating, generally they're good about providing a letterhead memo from the FBI saying that a company is participating in an investigation or supporting an investigation, and they support the request for an extension for notifications for that purpose. And so there are a lot of benefits of working with the FBI. And then the final thing, from a legal perspective, and this is from a technical perspective, from a legal perspective, from an insurance perspective, making sure you're implementing the remedial measures and making sure that you are applying those lessons learned so that it doesn't happen again. The absolute worst thing for a company, for any organization after a cyber breach, is to suffer another breach. Because from a financial perspective, it hits. From a reputational perspective, it hits. And then from the specter of liability, it goes up almost exponentially. Because if you're breached once, sometimes that's okay, it's forgivable. If you're breached again in the immediate aftermath, customers, clients, vendors, they're going to come knocking. So making sure
Mike, let's talk about that same thing. Can you talk through that from a business perspective? Just your relationships between your vendors and your clients and your company. What's this look like?
Yeah, and so early on, I highly recommend, as it makes sense to do, be very open and transparent with customers, with vendors, with partners about what's going on. That doesn't mean that you're going to give them root cause analysis. That doesn't mean that you're going to turn over the forensics report, but being very open and honest that we suffered a breach when you have made that determination. We suffered a ransomware attack when you made that determination, when it makes sense to do so. Customers, clients, vendors, partners, they appreciate this, and it also brings them in and makes them want to assist. In the current environment, the current climate, we are seeing breaches happen more and more. People are generally understanding that this is a part of business, and as long as you are doing everything you can to remediate, everything you can to get back to business, they generally understand and they're good about it. The one thing I will caution is that root cause analysis. If that root cause analysis determines that you are negligent in any way or grossly negligent, that can serve to invalidate any indemnifications that you have in some of your specific contracts. So those are the areas where you want to make sure that you are utilizing attorney-client privilege to protect that root cause analysis, or don't do the root cause analysis.
Mike, I see a quick note here that I think you want to share.
Oh, I do. If you're here for CLE credit, if you're an attorney, you're looking for it, the keyword is incident. Very creative.
Very nice.
Again, the keyword is incident.
And with that, let's run 60 seconds. We'll run through key takeaways and we'll wrap it up. So Mike, what's your key takeaway? So
my key takeaway, and I think I've been beating this drum the entire time, really understand what your obligations, what from a contractual perspective, regulatory, and a statutory perspective are very early on before the incident occurs. Know who your attorney is, know who your insurance carrier is, know who the DFIR team that you're going to bring on, have a plan in place so that when an incident occurs, you're ready.
And Corey?
Best that I can tell everybody is the proactive measures that you're doing on the front end are going to pay dividends down the road. I mean, it's going to help with it's going to give you a better coverage. It's going to provide better language in that insurance contract. And it's also going to help remove, hopefully, some sublimits that the insurer is putting on there for just risks that they're not willing to fully insure. So be proactive.
And I'll cue myself up. And the takeaway I want everybody to go away with is that IT and cybersecurity, there's collaboration, but each requires separate and appropriate consideration because they are two separate things. They contribute to each other, but understand that your IT team is going to help you operate and deliver. Cybersecurity is what's going to help you be resilient and do so, be able to operate and deliver even through adverse conditions, attacks, and compromises. Layers of defense, it's not all one bucket of everything goes into it. It's really two separate areas of expertise, two separate approaches.